Well, welcome everyone to our last CP support webinar. My name is Debbie Bayless, and today I'm going to be talking about Day 1 Amuzu Park Inc. So again, a big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for their fantastic partnership in ensuring that this valuable information is available to you as you write and prepare for CFE in this upcoming September. The presentation is approximately 90 minutes long, and then I'm going to open the floor for any questions that you may have. If you do have questions during this webinar, please use the Q&A function and my colleagues will answer your questions. So again, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Due to time constraints, if we're unable to answer your questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your region or province, and I've included their addresses there for you. I know that there are two common questions that are asked every webinar. So again, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available in a few days. Some candidates have asked us whether they would have access to the presentation deck, and unfortunately you will not. However, the great news is with the recording, you can stop it at any point and make your necessary notes. So I always like to, when it comes to the day one webinar, share some appropriate animal jokes. And this one is all about your communication. It is extremely important that your response is clear, concise, and easy to understand. So using your strong enabling competencies allows you to put your best foot forward and let that technical skill shine. The good news is you're not starting your journey towards your CPA. You're almost finished. And as you prepare and when you write CFE, it's important to tell yourself you will not fail. Without a doubt, preparing to write CFE and writing CFE can be stressful. If you haven't had an opportunity, please watch the stress management webinar. I shared some valuable techniques and how to reduce your stress because that's a key success factor in passing CFE. And know that you are going to make it to the outer side. And we are hoping that you will receive great news that you pass CFE and you're going to receive your CPA designation. So, an important notice and reminder. Please ensure that your response is based on the case facts provided, even if the situation outlined in the case is different than the current environment. So again, your response, analysis, and recommendations should be based on the case facts that are provided, not what the current environment is. And this applies to not only day one, but day two and day three cases. So I am going to be going through the Amuzu Park Inc., the key information from your Capstone 1 case. I'm going to talk about the situational analysis framework, or situational analysis for short. We're going to spend some time and I'm going to create a day one situational analysis and outline for a sample day one case. And then, of course, I'm going to open the floor for any questions you may have. So the two primary objectives, we want to ensure that you walk away from this webinar with the key information that you need to know from the Capstone 1 case, because some of this information might appear in the day one case. We also want to better prepare you to write for day one, and as a result, we're going to be sharing some best practices. So let's spend the next say 20, 25 minutes or so, going over the key information from Capstone 1. One of the things that CPA Canada highly recommends is that you memorize the company's mission, vision, values, and key success factors from the Capstone 1 case. Yes, you will be given a copy of the Capstone 1 case, but you certainly don't want to spend a lot of time shifting through all of that information to find the mission, vision, values, and more importantly, because the key success factors are pretty difficult to find. What you want to be able to do is have this information top of mind, because most of the time when it comes to day one, there may be some changes in the wording for mission and vision. Not very often are there many changes for the values. They might add another one. And the same applies to the key success factors. Most of them remain the same, and they might add an additional one. So you're going to notice on the slides here that I have key phrases underlined. These are the phrases and the comments you want to think about when you're analyzing the different strategic and operational options. So API's vision is to create Canadian-owned and operated amusement parks that visitors will leave feeling happy and thrilled and with lasting memories of a fun time. For the mission, it's to build amusement parks that are Canadian owned and operated, designed for safe, fun, and entertaining for all ages. The parks have rides that are best in the region, and park employees are dedicated to providing exceptional guest service. There are 5 values. They are to consistently upgrade and invest in new rides and attractions that will appeal to their target market, to ensure that those rides and attractions are maintained at the highest safety standards and that the ride operators are trained on and comply with manufacturing restrictions. Ensure the parks are safe and clean at all times. Exceed visitors' expectations by having employees that are courteous, honest, and dedicated to giving guests a great experience, and ensuring employees and visitors are always treated with respect and integrity. There are also 6 key success factors. And so these are key success factors in the industry. And they are, perception of high value for money by providing exceptional customer service, unique and perceived high quality rides, attractions, and immersive experiences, a high level of maintenance, cleanliness, and safety so that the parks are appealing and safe for all ages of visitors, branded as a fun, family-oriented park, a population of at least a few million people within reasonable driving distance, and access to a multi-skilled and flexible casual workforce. So when it comes to the board's objectives and constraints, it's important to know what were they in the Capstone 1 case. Be on the lookout. How did they do against these objectives? Do any of these objectives still exist? And the same, do any of these constraints still exist? So their objectives were to achieve annual revenue equal to or higher than their pre-pandemic annual revenue of 95 million. To increase average in-park per capita spending by 10%, to increase operating margin to 17%, and to expand the company's presence to all provinces in Canada. There was also a constraint. There was a bank covenant. So be on the lookout. Is there still a bank covenant in the day one case? Here it was interest-bearing debt to EBITDA, and it could be no more than 3 times, and no dividends were allowed to be declared. So anytime you are provided with the board's objectives and the constraints, it's extremely important that every time you analyze a strategic option, you need to talk about the impact implementing that option will have on the board's objectives and their constraints. So in other words, implementing a particular option, will it help the board achieve its goal? Will it meet the goal? Will it exceed the goal? Will it hinder them from meeting the goal, or there's no impact? And if you notice, I did not say, is the objective met or not met? Unfortunately, many candidates focus on simply stating it's met or not met. And in a recent Board of Examiners report, they highlighted that weak candidates focused and simply just stated if the objective was met or not met. And this did not give an accurate picture to the board. So again, make sure that when you're discussing the impact to the objectives, does it help? For example, if API's current operating margin is 12%, and if you implement that option, it'll end up increasing it to 13 or 14%. It helps API achieve the goal of 17%. So I'm going to talk about and focus on the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that existed in Capstone 1 case. When you perform your SWOT analysis for day 1, focus on the case facts in day 1. However, when I go through the weaknesses and threats, I have a few items that I've highlighted. I want you to be on the lookout for them. Do they still exist in the day 1 case? Because if they do, these are significant weaknesses and threats, and you need to consider those when you analyze the strategic options and when you provide your overall recommendations. So what were API's strengths? They had a wealth of knowledge and experience with classic, the traditional amusement parks. Their 3 smaller theme parks were differentiated from their competitors. Their primary concern was safety, and they paid slightly higher than minimum hourly wages. Now you're going to notice here that I have the case fact, in other words, the what. That's what's been given to you. And then I've used, for illustration purposes only, an equal sign. And that is to show you that I've also included the why, the impact. Simply stating a case fact will not end up, you won't meet the depth requirement. You must state the case fact and then discuss the implication. What's the potential positive or negative impact to the company? So again, in my formal response, I'm not going to leave that equal sign there, but I'm showing it to you for illustration purposes. And I use it as a technique when I create the outline. You'll see that shortly, to make sure I always include the why and the impact. So from a weakness perspective, here's a few things that I've highlighted and want you to be on the lookout. So in comparison to larger competitors, API has limited access to capital. And that's really important because in order to add new rides and experiences, it's very capital intensive. And if they don't do that, it could mean that they lose market share, which is going to reduce their revenue. There was a significant difference in the performance between API's small and large parks. So again, the large parks were Magical Land and Aqua Blue Park, and they were performing significantly poorer than the small parks. So be on a lookout to see if that issue still exists. They weren't investing in any unique rides or attractions. Their name was not well known across Canada, and they only had two sources of revenue. So it was just the admission and the food and beverages and merchandise. When it comes to opportunities, and when you create your SWOT analysis, which is part of your situational analysis for your response for the day one case, focus on opportunities that relate to the strategic and operational initiatives you've been asked to analyze. So in this instance, when it came to Capstone 1, immersive rides and attractions, international tourist markets were increasing. Theme parks, they were changing their business model. So they were offering exclusive luxury pricing model with reduced capacity. So no wait lines, but had to pay a premium price. Adding hotel to amusement parks, indoor amusement parks, and then the use of data analytics. So from a threats perspective, the very first factor I've have highlighted. So this industry overall is in the maturity stage. So what that means is it's not collectively, the industry is not growing. So in order to maintain their market share or, you know, gain market share, more aggressive action needed to be taken to increase revenue and profits. So be on the lookout. Is the industry still in the maturity stage? Because if it is, then you need to look for pockets of the industry that are doing well and specifically target markets that are growing. So consumer spending was only going to increase by 2.9 annually. The large market share of the revenue was being earned by amusement parks who were owned by publicly traded companies. So again, they had access to capital, economies of scale. The consumers wanted value for their money, and it's a very highly regulated industry. So let's take a moment and talk about API's overall financial performance. And this is in the context again of the Capstone 1 case. So when it came to those larger parks, their performance was significantly lower in many areas, sorry. So lower on return on capital, lower capacity utilization, lower EBITDA margins, and lower return on capital. So what's the implication? Well, if that trend continues, profits were going to remain low, or they could even decrease even more. So the performance of those large parks was a significant issue. How were they doing against the objectives? When it came to annual revenue growth, they were a bit higher from when it came to industry. However, there's a leading indicator measurement that indicated they weren't doing as well as the industry. Not measurement, but it's deferred revenue. So clients were buying season passes, and for ABI, that only represented 15.8% opposed to the industry of 22.1%. Their in-park per capita spending, it was decreasing. So if that trend continued, profits were going to continue to decrease. Profit margin was increasing, but still it was significantly lower than the industry benchmark of 17%. When it came to ratios from liquidity, solvency, they were lower than the industry, which meant that there were cash constraints, which didn't allow them for capital investments in new rides. So again, if they didn't invest in newer rides and experiences, that would and could very much impact negatively attendance and revenue. So cash flow, if the same amount was earned in 2024 as it was in 2023, after their principal and loan payments and capital expenditures, they were going to be short 7.25 million. So when you look at the day one case, it's very important to look at how are they from a cash flow perspective? What type of capital do they have to invest in new strategic initiatives? Their interest-bearing debt to EBITDA was 2.66, which also was higher than industry, which meant that they were more leveraged, and that limited their ability for financing. So anytime you perform a high level quantitative analysis, it's important to provide some overall conclusions. Because what happens is before you even know what the strategic options are, you're going to have a good sense of what specific types of options are going to be more important, are going to help the company improve its financial health. So lower profits and lower return on capital. Why was that happening? Because they were paying higher wages and they were paying higher interest expenses. Their current strategy for the two large parks, it's not working. And so profits, they're going to continue to decline. So this is not a sustainable strategy. So in order to ensure long-term success, API, during the Capstone 1 case, needed to reconsider their current strategy. So their current strategy was the classic amusement park for young families, the types of rides and attractions, and their target market. So again, see if these are still some issues. So when you're analyzing the different strategic options, once you've performed your high-level quantitative analysis, you're going to have identified some areas of concern. And when you analyze this new strategic options, you need to think about and discuss how is that going to impact the company's overall financial health. So when it comes to the stakeholders and their objectives, it's just important to know who the key players were. Be on the lookout day one. Are they still the same individuals or have some of the members changed? As far as their objectives and personal preferences, they will tell you in the day one case what their new objectives and preferences are. So Jacob, the CEO and chair of the board, he wanted to embrace more technology and invest in more niche attractions. Terry, the VP of marketing and sales, believed that, the parks were attracted to families because they were looking for good play and outdoor fun. They want to get away from the technology. However, he felt that you should focus on international marketing to attract more visitors. Natalie, VP of HR, she wanted to stay true to the nostalgia design of the rides and the layout of the amusement parks. Kenneth, the VP of Rides and Technologies, wanted to focus on unique and differentiating attractions because this is the growing segment. So when it comes to the strategic options and financing, again, it's just important to know what they were. When you read your day one case, they will tell you what strategic option or options they implemented. It could be one or more of the options that were available in the Capstone 1 case, and or they might add another option that you've never heard of. For financing, just be on the lookout and how did they finance whatever strategic options they implemented. So from the Capstone 1 case, the first option was to start up a traveling carnival with GEA. A Canadian, second was the Canadian High Arctic Immersion Experience. And so that was a co-sponsorship with Arctica Outwear Company, an indoor amusement park at a Georgian International Hotel. And the last option was a joint arrangement with Willow Lakes Amusement Park, or WALAP. And that was focusing on one of the large parks, one of the problem areas, Aqua Blue Park. When it came to financing, there were two options: to refinance the London bank loan, so it increase it to 65 million, so that was an additional 8 million, and then the covenant would change. It would be no more than 2.5 times EBITDA. So again, be on the lookout. Did they use that financing? What is the covenant? Because you want to make sure that you do none of your recommendations breach the covenant. Wallap would purchase 18,000 common shares for 10 million. And, only if their proposal was accepted. And if it was, Raoul would have a seat on the board with one vote. So from operational issues, again, all you really need to know is what were they? Be on the lookout. Do any of these problems still exist? And or did they do anything? They'll let you know. So the ethical issue was the ride operators were not following the guidelines for riders. They were accepting bribes to let children on the ride, so they were not as tall as they needed to be. Safety and Park, they wanted information on Safety and Park Risk Assessment Committee. They were looking at outsourcing the pizza food. There was an issue with the payroll system and processes. There were complaints. So employees were being underpaid for hours worked and the rates used were incorrect. There was also an impact of a previous error when it came to CCA. And the board had asked you, the consulting team, to provide them with some recommendations when it came to environmental sustainable initiatives. So at this point, I'd like to take a moment and talk about overarching or significant issues. And these, for the most part, are significant weaknesses or significant threats. And they impact both the strategic and operational decisions that the company needs to make. And they have a very significant impact to the overall recommendations you need to provide. So let's talk about a few of these, because be on the lookout for these, because if they exist, it is critical that they're part, that if it's a significant weakness, that it's under your weakness. Same applies if it's a significant threat. And then when you're analyzing each of the strategic options, you need to consider in your qualitative analysis, implementing that option. Will it have a positive impact on that significant weakness or threat? So some of the examples of overarching significant issues are poor communication. So there's conflict to the point among the board that they're not able to make strategic decisions. There could be a conflict of interest. For example, a board member might be wanting a particular strategic option to be implemented for personal reasons and not looking at what's in the best interest of the company. There could be a lack of long-range planning. There could be supply and or production constraints, capital constraints. If there are constraints, please ensure that they're identified in your situational analysis and that every strategic option and any of the operational issues that you discuss, it is critical that you discuss the impact to those constraints. And your overall recommendations do not exceed those constraints, because if you do, your recommendation is not credible. And if your recommendation is not credible, that will result in you achieving a no for your overall recommendation, which does result in a fail. So this is very important. And I'm going to show you a format to use that will ensure that you address these, address the constraints if they exist. Limited cash to invest in strategic options, or potentially there's going to be limited cash because something's occurring in the near future, whether it's repayment of debt, repurchase of shares. Lack of focus on core business. So sometimes in the narrative, it'll say that, we implemented this option and we've ended up spending so much time that we really haven't focused on our main business. That has a significant impact to the decisions that they need to make moving forward, because they need to focus on the core business. Lack of innovation, inability to reduce costs. The company's competitive advantage is eroding. Unrealistic timelines. Downturn in the economy. There's a downturn. That's a significant issue. And that means you need to look for strategic options that are going to capitalize on areas in the industry that are growing and target markets that are growing. Limited management resources. Lots of times in the narrative, they will say that management, because in this instance, the board of directors are also the senior managers. So what's happening is they could be spread very, very thin. There could be some errors happening in the operations. Maybe some strategic decisions aren't being made. So when you're looking at the strategic options, you need to consider, will this use more of management's time, which already they don't have enough time? Will it free up their time? If it does, that's a very strong reason to implement that option. When you provide your overall recommendations, it's also critical. Maybe all of those options are viable. But first and foremost, you can't recommend all four of them if management is already struggling to do what they have at hand. First thing you need to talk about is how to free up management's time, and then prioritize the options, recognizing that management's time is limited. So what were the overarching significant issues that were that impacted both the strategic and operational decisions that API needed to make? Talked about industries in the maturity stage, access to capital and cash, and the large parks performance. So again, these were, and part of our job as CPAs is to be able to identify the factors that play a significant role in a decision. These are all significant issues. What's the implication? So based on maturity, limited access to capital and cash, the large parks performance, they needed to determine a strategy for those large parks, find segments of the industry that was growing and target markets that were growing. So when you have a significant weakness threat, it's important to think about every time you're looking at those strategic options, does that address one of these significant issues? If it does in a positive manner, that's a very strong advantage for that particular option. So let's spend a moment and talk about day one of CFE. So as you know, it's a 4-hour exam. It's the one comprehensive case and it's linked to Capstone 1. So for all of you who are watching, I'm hoping that you're signed up to write the API. The focus is on your enabling competencies. And day one is assessed individually and separately from day 2 and day 3. The assessment is a pass or fail assessment. And you're tested at the core level. So let's talk about the situational analysis framework, or let's just call it situational analysis for short. First of all, it is the very first part of your response. And you're going to use it as a checklist. So when you're looking at the different required, you're going to consider such things as, is that particular required aligned with the company's mission, vision, and values? Does it capitalize on the industry's key success factors, the company's strengths, or the opportunities in the industry? Does it mitigate the company's weaknesses and reduce the threats in the industry? Does it help the company achieve its objectives? Does it help the company improve its financial concerns and meet the covenants? So let's take a moment and go through what are the common elements of a situational analysis. Well, they're pretty much all of the key information that I shared with you about the Capstone 1 case, almost all of them. So the mission, vision, values, and key success factors, objectives, constraints, so be on the lookout for covenants, supply constraints, production constraints, and of course, a SWOT analysis. Make sure that you don't simply state the case fact. You must make sure that you include the why. Why is it a strength? So in other words, the why is, what's the implication, the potential positive impact to the company? The good news is that you are able to use this information, the factors you've identified from your situational analysis. You can use the same factor more than once when you analyze the strategic options. And I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to share and kind of explain integration a little bit more. And the great news is when I create the situational analysis and the outline, I'm going to really show you specific examples. Another common element of your situational analysis is a quantitative analysis. And that's a high level analysis. And the goal is to gain an understanding of the company's overall financial health and to identify areas of concern. So again, they will most likely give you objectives, quantitative objectives. So how is the company performing against those new objectives? If there's more than one revenue source, which source accounts for most of the revenue? If they're looking at revenue growth, which source is contributing to revenue growth in a positive or a negative way? Profit margin. Again, which revenue source is contributing in a positive or a negative way? Always, if you can, if you've provided the information, look at the capital, look at the cash flow, sorry. If it's limited, do they have the ability, access to financing? Because limited cash, what's the implication is limited cash is going to have a negative impact on the number or the types of strategic and operational initiatives API can implement. Make sure that you provide an overall conclusion, okay? because even before you know what the options are, it's important to know what needs to be done. So, for example, to improve revenue and profit margins, it's important to focus on segments and target markets in the industry that are growing. So that means that you're going to pay priority to the strategic options where they are catering to the market, the segment of the market that's growing, and or target markets that are growing. So, what types of quantitative analysis could you do? It depends on what they give you. Sometimes in the day one case, they give you a lot and you're able to calculate ratios. You're able to compare them to industry benchmarks. Sometimes they give you very little. So whatever they give you in the narrative, make sure that you extract that so that you can talk about, at minimum, you want to talk about the changes in the financial statement accounts. Again, be on the lookout for covenants. Revenue, is it increasing, decreasing? What's happening with operating margin? In this instance, in park capita, is it increasing? We know based on Capstone 1, debt capacity was high. Is it still? So again, identify those areas of concern. And when you're analyzing the different strategic options, consider, will it help improve API's overall financial health? So when it comes to writing your situational analysis, there's actually two parts. So as I said, the first part of your response is your situational analysis. The second part is integration. So that's including these relevant situation analysis factors in your analysis of the strategic and operational issues. So in order for it to count for integration, that factor must be included in your situational analysis, and that factor must be also included in your analysis of a strategic or operational issue. If you do that, it will count as one towards the integration requirement. Later on, I'm going to show you what the integration requirement is. So there's several opportunities for integration. From a qualitative perspective, whether it's from your SWOT, key success factors, alignment, misalignment with mission, vision, or values. You'll notice here I've highlighted to start with your SWOT. Use that as your primary integration opportunity. And the reason I say that is because these tend to be the strongest factors that exist internally and externally. Then look at the key success factors. Last but certainly not least, consider whether implementing that option is aligned with the company's mission, vision, or values. And the reason I have here secondary, unless a differentiator, is because more often than not, most of those strategic options you're looking at, they are not, they might be partly aligned. Some of the wording might need to change, but it is very unusual that any of the strategic options they give you are completely misaligned with a company's mission, vision, or value. In other words, it is completely against who they are and what they do. So if all of them are at least partly aligned, that really isn't a differentiating factor. It's not going to, it isn't going to make a difference on why you would recommend one versus another. Because unfortunately what has happened is some candidates and the Board of Examiners have highlighted it, that weak responses focus on alignment with mission, vision, and values. Don't go there first, go to SWOT. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, for integration, you want to talk about the impact to the objectives and the impact to the constraints. So let's talk about outlining. And some of this is repetitive. I hope that you've had an opportunity to watch the day 2 and path to competent and day 3 and time management, where I also talked about outlining and shared similar best practice. So why should you create an outline? The best practice I'm going to show you is about extracting the relevant case facts. That ensures in your response that you highlight the important case facts. I'm also going to share with you a structure to use. And if you have the relevant case facts, you have your outline created in such a way the structure's already there. It will really help you manage your time because you can quickly turn your response, your outline into your response. You'll have everything within Word and it becomes your roadmap for your response. It also allows you to take a step back, and when you're figuring out how much time you should allocate to each of the required, you're able to look at what do you already have done and how much do you have left to do for each of the required. So you're able to determine how much time you should allocate for each required. So you can write and create your outline electronically in Word, or you can handwrite it. Now, there is no right or wrong answer. And for some candidates, they do a combination. Some people see in pictures. And so what I have found is they will create their outline in Word. However, if they want to be able to kind of think about the connections, they'll take a blank page from the rough booklet and they'll kind of draw a picture and show sort of the connections between each of the required. That'll give them a good visual. It needs to be determined based on your personal choice and style. I do want to really encourage you to try, if you haven't done already, to try and create your outline in Word. And I'm not talking just a shell of what the requireds are. So again, I'm going to show you a best practice very shortly. The reason I say that is recently in May, I am an exam supervisor in one of the exam centers. And it was 75 minutes into the day 1 case, and we're all walking around, and we noticed that everybody had their information in Word. They had several pages, and a lot of them were using the best practices. However, there was one candidate in the room who was highlighting like crazy, writing in the margins, had information, some kind of resemblance of an outline on paper. But it was 75 minutes in, and she had nothing in Word, while her peers had most of the information they needed to be able to turn it into a response. So again, it really does help with, I strongly believe it really does help with time management. But if you haven't done it, you need to practice it. It takes time. So let's spend some time creating a situational analysis and an outline for a day 1 case. So for those of you who have been enrolled in Capstone 2, I'm going to create the situational analysis and an outline for the module workshop for Capstone 2. We're also going to spend a little bit of time when it comes to the large park target segment. So that's the first strategic option. So bear with me for a moment. Okay, so on one side of your screen, you should see a slide deck. And on the other side of the screen, you should actually see the case. So before I even read the case, the first thing I'm going to do is set up my memo. So to, from, and regarding. When it comes to, I know I need to create my situational analysis. So I'm going to include all of the key elements. So vision, mission, values, key success factors, objectives and constraints, quantitative analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You'll notice I've put objectives and constraints together, and I've done that on purpose because once I filled in what they are, I want to be able to copy those and include them under every strategic option. The benefit of creating your outline in Word is you have that lovely copy and paste option. So let's start the reading, outlining, and planning process. So the first step is to allocate your time for planning. So for ROP, which is reading, outlining, and planning, 75 minutes. So from 9, my start time is 9 to 10:15, I'm going to read, create my outline, and allocate my time for the requireds. The remaining 165 minutes, I'm going to write my response. Now I will break that down into smaller chunks once I know what the strategic options are. The next is to read the narrative. So let's look at the narrative. So in the first two paragraphs, there's some important information. The timeline. So the date is March 18th, 2026. My role is as a consultant, and already here's some information for under opportunities and threats. You'll notice what I've done is I've put in the key case fact, and beside it, I've put in an equal sign. That is my trigger. I need to go back and include the why and the impact. Again, I'm using it for a trigger to make sure that I include the why and impact. I won't have an equal sign when I'm done my response. So let's continue on. So in the next few paragraphs, there's a few strengths, a weakness. There's some information that I can put under my quantitative analysis. And then there's a quick summary of what's happened. So for strengths, there's a strong attendance numbers at their smaller parks. So the smaller parks are still doing good. Monique Fisher has expertise, local connections, and she's a board member. So that's a strength that they can lend on. Here is a significant weakness. And this relates to what we talked about when it came to the Capstone 1 case. So Magical Land, Aqua Blue, those parks are stagnating. The in-park spending per capita is 2% lower, and there's fewer pre-sold passes. So this is something that I know I need to make sure that when I'm looking at those strategic options, would they address this significant weakness? They've given me some quantitative information. Anytime there's quantitative information in the narrative, I always pull it out, put it in my outline. Might not know where it goes, but I find that I need it. And if I don't pull it out now, I could lose it. I wanted to, now you're noticing that, gee, Debbie, you have everything highlighted. You have lots of information highlighted. You've got, kind of what category it falls under. I've done that for illustration purposes only. I've done that so you can see where I've extracted the case information and where it falls. When I'm writing an outline, if it's important, I'm typing it in. I'm not highlighting it, writing in the margins, and then typing in. That's doing the work more than once. Every minute counts. So, what happened? And again, this you can include. For me, I always like to kind of remind myself, but you don't need to include this in your outline and it's not going to be part of your response. But they invested in GEA and they hired Monique. So let's go down to the next paragraph. And in that next paragraph, there's a weakness and there's more information about what happened. And it also tells us that the company's mission, vision, and values have remained the same. So weakness, the board chose to take a hold and wait approach for large parks. What else happened? So they didn't outsource the pizza operations and they did refinance with a term loan. Okay. Said the vision and mission didn't change. So I'm going to write those in. You notice values, and I've just put unchanged. I am only going to, why would I type in all of the values if I'm not going to use them? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave that empty for now. And when I go and prepare my qualitative analysis for the different options, if I've got enough without the alignment with values, I won't include it. If I need it, I will include it. Why spend time typing on something I might not need? Because it doesn't count. The only way it counts is if it's in my situational analysis and I apply it to my analysis of any of the strategic or operational issues. So the next paragraph, the wording in most day one cases are quite similar. I'm just going to write this down to remind myself. Well, we need to provide a recommendation for each proposal. We need to identify if there's any significant factors or issues that they didn't consider. We need to identify information that's needed before making any decisions. So let me provide you with some examples. So based on the information that you're provided with, you as a CPA should be able to provide the board of the board of directors with a recommendation. However, when you're performed your analysis, you might have identified an assumption that is very optimistic. For example, they might have told you to use 10% revenue growth, but the case fact told you that industry growth is only 2%. And so, based on your quantitative and qualitative analysis, implementing that option makes sense. However, if that if that revenue growth is more like industry, that would have a significant impact, say, if you calculated NPV. So you could, as a caveat to your recommendation, say that you recommended the strongest 3 to 4 quantitative and qualitative reasons why, but highlight that it's important to validate that, it's a 10% revenue growth is realistic. Another option is say that you have unaudited financials and you're determining the valuation of the company based on unaudited financials. Again, it makes sense. Recommend it. State the 3 to 4 strongest quantitative, qualitative reasons why. And then also recommend before they implement to validate, to perform the necessary due diligence. So that's the types of kind of caveats and additional information that you should highlight. Comment on API's overall strategic direction, including the impact each proposal has on that direction, which also alludes to the fact of, is there any interrelationship? So implementing one option, does that mean it complements another? Does that mean because you implemented a particular option, you couldn't implement another? Always be on the lookout for those significant overarching issues. So those significant weaknesses and threats. So the next step is step 3. And that's all about scanning the appendices and rereading the requireds. So first of all, at this point, we don't know what the requireds are, but look at the list of appendices. So we know the transcript of the board meetings. That's where we're going to find out what the requireds are. Industry updates. I always know that there'll be lots of information there for my SWOT. Then it talks about theme park preferences by demographic segment, large park operations. So I'm like, not 100% sure. I'm hoping that, there's something that we're looking at for the large parks. API at night. Okay, there's a food service proposal. Midway Games expansion, and there's a park photography policy. So it looks like we potentially have 4 strategic options and an operational issue. So that photography policy. Okay. But I'm going to keep going through and read the transcript of the board meetings. So in the first few paragraphs, again, here's reinforcing this significant weakness that Magical Land and Aqua Blue, that they need to attract a larger audience, both domestic and international, to generate a decent profit. Because what they've been doing too is they've been trying to appeal to everyone to increase attendance numbers for the large parks. So again, large parks, something needs to be done. Here's our first objective. Large parks, the total EBITDA needs to be at least 15 million. So as I'm scrolling down here, it becomes obvious that the first required is to determine the appropriate target market for the large parks. So before I extract any other relevant case facts, let's set up the appropriate structure we should use. And for that, it's going to be use the title. Your heading is going to be whatever the required is. You need to perform a quantitative analysis, a qualitative analysis, and provide a recommendation. Now you notice here under quantitative, I have assumptions and impact to objectives and constraints. And there's a very good reason why. You'll see that in a little while. And under qualitative, I'm going to include pros and cons. Again, the benefit is I can put my structure in place. So before I even include any other information, I'm going to copy and paste that structure for the other strategic options. So API at night, the food services, and the midway games. So now let's start to extract the relevant case facts for the large park strategy. And the case tells us that there's 2 segments. So families with younger children, referred to as the younger segment, families with older children and young adults, referred to as the older segment. So I start to extract the relevant case facts when it comes to the older segment. And again, you'll notice that I'm extracting the relevant case fact. I'm using the equal sign to indicate that I need to come back and include the why and the impact. And when it comes to the recommendation, I need to recommend which segment. So as we go through, there's a tremendous amount of information about each of these segments. So I'm going to extract that information, okay, and put it under the appropriate, whether it's younger or older. So at this point, before I even go and read onwards, I'm sitting here thinking the best way to set this up when it comes to my qualitative analysis is, so instead of putting older segment, pros, cons, younger segment, pros, cons. The pros for the older segment are the cons for the younger segment and vice versa. So that's a really good way of setting up my structure. So due to time constraints, as you can see, I've read the remaining parts and the different requireds, but we're going to kind of go through that information. What I do want to point out, okay, is we're going to keep going and let's just see here. So when we get to this section, okay, so in a real life situation, you would have included all of the relevant case facts for the other strategic options. Here are some more objectives and constraints. So they have only 2.5 million available when it comes to capital, and the expectation is 10% return on investment. So here's some very important information. Without even looking at what type of quantitative information they give me, I know that, I know that we need to look at the impact to EBITDA. So if I can calculate EBITDA, that is a good quantitative analysis to perform. Cash flow. Cash flow will have a positive impact on EBITDA. That's a good quantitative analysis to perform. I have 10% return on investment, so I can calculate, if I've got the right information, return on investment. I could also calculate NPV. So without looking at anything, I already know some types of quantitative analysis I can perform. So I'm going to show you when it comes to the required for the photography policy changes. Oh, sorry, but before I do that, I want to highlight. So at this point now, we have all the objectives and the constraints. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to copy it and put it under every strategic option. So when I prepare my response, I'm going to talk about whether implementing that option is going to have a positive impact on EBITDA. How much of that capital is it going to use? Will it provide, a 10% return on investment if that's appropriate? Okay, so then let's look at the proposed photography policy changes. So in that aspect, all I need to do is conduct a qualitative analysis and provide recommendations. So in this instance, I'm just going to pull out the relevant case facts. Again, use that equal sign. I'll divide them up later into pros and cons, but I really have my response. I've got it well over 50% done. So our next appendices is the industry information. And at this point, now we're really starting to extract the relevant information from the appendices and organize it. And there's all kinds of integration opportunities. So there's several opportunities and there's several threats. So I want to show you, look at all the opportunities for integration. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to write down all these factors under opportunities. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the ones that are relevant and put them under the appropriate strategic option required that I'm analyzing. So for example, growth in demand for exclusive or premium experiences. They're willing to pay to have more of an experience with limited availability. Well, that applies to API at night. The partnership with the food and beverage providers, that applies to the food services. When it comes to information about international travel and the demographics, talks about the older segment, that applies to the target market for the older segment when it comes to the large parks. For domestic tourists is increasing 1 to 2%. That applies to the younger segment when we're talking about the strategy for the target market for the large parks. A threat is that their strong labor market is resulting in recruiting challenges, especially when it comes to entry level and seasonal positions. Again, I need to include the why and the impact, but this information, it will apply to my analysis of API at night, the Midway Games, and the photography policy change. So here in just those, four little paragraphs, there's all kinds of opportunity for integration. You notice too at the bottom of that page that they also have great information for my quantitative analysis. The great news is they've already calculated them. So I am going to include that information and I'm going to provide some narrative, an explanation of why that number is different than industry based on the information provided in the case. So if we look at the next appendices, this is information, and I'm going to just kind of scroll so that you can see there's all kinds of information here, qualitative for your analysis when it comes to younger segment versus older segment. And there's also some quantitative information. So first of all, what I would recommend is under your quantitative analysis is put the appendices numbers, okay, so that you could come back when you perform your quantitative analysis. There's an important piece right now that it's saying EBITDA is almost 14.4 million and putting that down. And I'm also putting what the average in-park per capita spending is. So right now it's $44.99. Well, hey, EBITDA's 14, close to 14.4 million. Need to put that under my quantitative analysis as part of my situational analysis because they're going to need almost 611,000 more is needed for the board to achieve that 15 million. Going to provide a conclusion when it comes to my quantitative analysis. So in other words, to help increase API's chances of long-term success, they need to determine appropriate strategy for the large parks that'll increase attendance and in-park capital spending. Okay, so at this point, let's assume that we've taken all of the information and extracted it, because again, I'm very cognizant of our time constraints. So we would then perform the remaining steps. Step 5 is all about, pausing for a moment. Are there significant issues? Yes, we know that a significant weakness is the first thing that needs to be taken care of is a plan for the large parks. Plan what you're going to do. Determine the appropriate quantitative tool. Well, I already have some pretty good ideas based on what the objectives are. Then the next steps, you do them kind of in tangent, which is order those required, rank them, and allocate your time. When you're ordering them to, think about the fact, beyond the, already think about, is there integration? Okay, because we've been talking a lot about, the case talks a lot about younger segment versus older segment. And those segments will also impact some of the other strategic options. So the order that the requireds were given to you in, those are the order that you can actually write your response. Now that's unusual, okay? They may have, in the case, they may have done the photography policy change in the middle. Well, you know that that is, you don't need to perform a quantitative and qualitative. It's not strategic. You're going to allocate less time. So make sure that if you've got an operational issue, that it's at the bottom, okay? Or you're going to end up spending a disproportional amount of time. So based on how much information I have in the outline, I'm going to allocate my time. I'm going to allocate a little bit more time to the large parks. 35 minutes, 30 minutes for the other. For the photography changes, that's all, that's at least 2/3 of the way done, 10 minutes. Make sure you allocate at least 15 minutes for your overall recommendations, and then leave some time to be able to perform a review. So let's take a moment and go through the feedback guide. So this is the feedback guide for sample day 1. So again, let's talk about what do you need to do to meet the integration requirements? Well, you needed to integrate three factors from the situational analysis for large parks, API, the food proposal, and the Midway Games expansion. Not a problem. When it came to the photography, you needed to integrate two factors from the situational analysis. Again, very possible. When it came to your overall quantitative analysis, you needed to either perform or discuss, three ratios or three items from the financial statement. Again, very, very possible. And the good news is you don't need to achieve this for every single requirement in order to achieve a yes. You need to achieve, so meet that three factors from your situational analysis for three of the elements and at least one partial. So once candidates know what the requirements are when it comes to integration, it's not normally a problem. So when it comes to what the Board of Examiners have seen for weaker responses is SWOT, just listed the case facts, didn't talk about the why, didn't answer that question, so what? When it came to mission vision, simply said it was lying, didn't demonstrate how. They didn't focus on the most important situational elements, those most important factors when it came to the decisions that they needed to make. Because remember, what you're being tested on when it comes to day one is you're being tested on your ability to demonstrate that you have a clear understanding of the internal and external environment in which the company operates, what they want to achieve, and what you've done is when you've analyzed all of your requirements every single time, you've carefully considered the most relevant factors internally and externally, what they wanted to achieve. And when you provided your overall recommendations, again, you've considered the most relevant case factors. That ensures that your recommendations are convincing and credible. So let's look at that large park target segment. So what was needed to achieve an overall yes? So when it came to the quantitative analysis, you needed to reasonably calculate and discuss the EBITDA or cash flow for the younger, for the older. And you needed to do two out of these three, reasonably calculate the average in-park per capita spending for both segments. So again, what dictated the type of analysis you needed to do was the information that was provided and their objectives. Do you notice the word it says calculate and discuss? Discuss means in your word response. So you don't simply just say see exhibit. So again, that was achievable. If you notice too underneath, discusses other valid financial implications or quantitative considerations of the analysis. You know what that is? That's your assumptions. That's the reason I say under your quantitative analysis, include a subtitle for assumptions. What you need to meet that is not to state your inputs. That's included in Excel. It's to, the case will give you some information and they will say, they will provide you or indication that maybe that some of those inputs might be off, okay? They might be different. So identify one or two of the assumptions that are made that could be different based on the case facts that are provided. State why they could be different and state what the impact would be to the quantitative analysis. So you don't simply state, If the revenue growth percentage is different, then the quantitative results will be different. That's basic math, okay? What's the reason why the revenue would be different? And would it have a positive or negative impact on NPV if that's what you've calculated? I have seen in many instances that doing that right when it comes to the assumptions, that could be the difference between achieving a no on your quantitative, so moving it from a no to a partial or moving it from a partial to a yes. When it comes to your qualitative, okay, you need to identify a minimum of 6 pros and cons, and you need to make sure that conversation is not one-sided. So you have to have at least one pro, one con. You can't simply state case facts. You must explain the why and the impact. Answer that question, so what? Again, that is very achievable. So the good news is too, in order to achieve an overall yes for the strategic options, you can achieve a partial on one element and a yes on another. So let's talk about some strategy here. From a quantitative perspective, you don't want to spend all your time on your quantitative analysis because there's probably a chance that you are going to make some errors, but you're going to do the best that you can within the time frame that you have. But don't spend a disproportional amount because you can achieve an overall yes by meeting yes for your qualitative and partial for your quantitative. Please make sure. So many candidates have put disproportional amount of energy into the quantitative analysis and have not met that and then did not meet the qualitative. Qualitative, that's an easier one to get a yes. So weak respondents, they spent too much time in the quantitative, made it overly complicated. They performed the incorrect calculations, failed to challenge the validity of the data provided or question the projections. That's the assumptions. That's why I'm saying use that format. They failed to link the result to the company's objectives. That's why I say use the format of impact to the objectives and constraints. So structure matters. The structure that I'm sharing with you is to help increase your chances of meeting those required and an overall yes. So under your quantitative analysis, make sure that you include maximum of 2 to 3 sentences summarizing your results, okay? Don't tell them how you calculated it. Again, that's all in Excel. What were the results? What does that mean? Is it viable from a quantitative perspective? Identify those main assumptions that could be different based on case facts. State whether it's going to have a positive or negative impact. Talk about the impact to those objectives. If you can calculate it, great. If not, does it help? Does it meet? Does it exceed? Does it hinder? Qualitative pros, cons. Don't forget the why and impact. And for your recommendation, do not say, based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend to implement this option. No, not all qualitative factors are equal. Provide the 3 to 4 strongest quantitative and qualitative reasons for your recommendations. So that's why the structure that I recommended, it is geared towards addressing those requirements. When here's great examples of integration, you're including the impact to the quantitative. So you'll end up talking about the increase to EBITDA. You need to look at it for both the younger, the older. For the younger, you don't need to worry about ROI because there is an investment required. But for older, you need to comment. You need to comment on the impact to the constraint. So when it came to qualitative, some candidates just, they only had a one-side discussion. No, we're CPAs. We need to look at both the advantages and disadvantages. They didn't talk about the how when it came to, they just simply said it's aligned with the mission. Didn't provide specifics. Didn't talk about the so what. Didn't focus on those key qualitative factors, okay? Again, the significant weaknesses and threats. They focused more on the operational. So let me give you an example. Key success factor is family oriented, okay? So targeting families with younger children is more likely to be perceived as family oriented. That addresses the how. When you talk about key success factors, you have to say how that's addressed and what's the potential impact. That could increase their chances of success because that's the strategy that's working well for the small parks. When it comes to the how for values, so one of API's values is to continuously upgrade, invest in new rides and attractions. Well, the older segment is interested in new technology. That's a how, which is aligned with this value. So when it comes to your recommendation, you need to provide a supported recommendation for each of the requireds. Then you also need to provide an overall recommendation. And that overall recommendation needs to address several requirements. You need to prioritize which one should be implemented first and why. Acknowledge any interrelationships and consider the big picture. So I wanted to really highlight here, when it comes to your overall recommendation, if you achieve a no, and a no would be because you have not considered a very significant, obvious reason, okay, issue that needs to be addressed, you have exceeded the capital or you've exceeded a constraint. If you achieve a no, if you're awarded a no for your overall recommendation, that results in a fail. If you achieve a partial on your overall recommendation, the highest rating you will achieve is a marginal pass. It's a pass, but it would be a marginal pass. So there's three things: prioritize, discuss interrelationships, and calculate impact. So start off with, I recommend the following in the order of priority. There's a significant issue, management has limited time, and that needs to be addressed first to make sure that they can effectively implement your recommendations. State the option, give them a reason why it needs to be, why you're recommending it, first. So in this instance, for the module workshop, the first decision is which segment for the larger park. Those interrelationships. You know what? Does one option complement another? If you implement one option, does that mean you can't implement another? There are lots of examples of interrelationship when it comes to the module workshop day one. And it's all around the segments, okay? Because in some instances, when it came to API, the older segment would have higher disposable income. They would have been able to pay and be more interested in API at night. For the food services, older segment would also be a very good choice. So again, I've highlighted here some of the interrelationships. For the module workshop case, you had 2.5 million available. You need to calculate the cost of what's the total cost of recommending your recommendations. Don't exceed it. What the Board of Examiners found, that when it came to the overall recommendations, that weaker responses, they were less likely to acknowledge and incorporate the ways in which the strategic opportunities, impact each other. So that whole piece about the interrelationship. And what they did is they just simply copied and pasted their recommendations for each of the strategic options. Do not do that. Okay? Do not do that. because you need to sit back, look at the big picture, and then think about it in the context of what should be implemented first, second, and so on. Communication. Make sure your response is easy to understand, clear and concise. Your quantitative analysis is easy to follow. Make sure there's limited spelling and grammatical errors, and you use professional language, of course. So what do you need to do to pass? You have to achieve yes when it comes to integration. We know that's pretty straightforward. You have to achieve yes for at least two of the strategic options. You have to achieve yes for conclude and advise, yes for communication, and partial on all of the remaining assessment opportunities. So what that means is you need to manage your time well. If you do not address an assessment opportunity, that automatically results in a fail. So make sure that when you're allocating your time, you're following your time very carefully. So let's put all the all the pieces of the puzzle together. So remember that situational analysis, you're going to highlight the important decision factors. You're going to spend 75 minutes creating it and your outline and allocating. Now, your situational analysis does not need to be really long. Okay, so don't spend a disproportionate amount of time. In the 75-minute point, you want to have that done and your outline. Memorize mission, vision, values, and key success factors from Capstone 1. Make sure that format that I've used, okay, works well. Impact to the objectives and constraints. Don't forget your why and your impact when it comes to your qualitative and your SWOT. Make sure you allocate 15 to 20 minutes to prepare your overall recommendations. My heart sinks every time as an exam supervisor when I say, and you have 5 minutes left, and I'm walking around and I'm seeing people who are just starting their overall recommendation. And no, make sure that you need to meet these three requirements. Prioritize, state why they're being prioritized in the org. If there's any interrelationships, you need to talk about them. Calculate the impact to the constraints and the objectives if possible. This is, as I shared in Understanding the CFE, they take a step back and say, did the candidate look at the big picture? Did they prioritize? Did the information? Did they use the right quantitative tools that added values, performed a qualitative analysis? Did they integrate the relevant factors from the situational analysis? Was their conclusion, did it add value? And was their response clear and easily understood? So, as I said, this is the last CFE support webinar. These webinars were designed as your roadmap to successfully passing CFE. So at this point, all of the recordings, I've been advised they're all available except this one, which will be available in the next few days. So the information can be found in D2L homepage, whether it's Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE, or if you're enrolled in Capstone 2. Please, we value your feedback. Please take the time to fill out the survey. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor for any questions you may have.
All right, perfect. No, thanks there, Debbie, for presenting tonight's webinar. So, on behalf of the CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business, we thank you for putting all the webinars in this CFE support webinar series. So, as Debbie just mentioned, I just put it in the chat right now. If you guys can fill out the survey tool, that would be great, as it just allows us in terms of get some feedback from you guys on what you guys felt was great and any additional edits we could potentially do in future webinar series, that would be awesome. So just wanted to just reiterate that there, just in terms of everything there. We'll have about 10 minutes or so in regards to the Q&A portion here. So if we weren't able to answer your question, we do apologize there, but we'll try to get through as many as we can in regards to tonight. So Debbie, we'll just jump in terms of the
Sounds
Q&A
good.
there. So the first question was, this is going back to earlier in the webinar, but the candidate was asking, does the candidate need to write the mission and vision, values, and key success factors in full sentences that were shown, or can they rephrase or use shorter bullet points in the CFE? So they're just looking for efficiencies in regards to time there.
Right. And you know what? For the key success factors and the values, yes, you can paraphrase those. When it comes to the mission and vision, you should include those full items, but certainly for the values, that's why I kind of highlighted the key words too. For the values and key success factors, yes, you can paraphrase those.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to do word for word in regards to that there. The marker just looking for, did you identify it? Did you understand what was going on there? All right, the next question, which I think is a very important question that's come up is, so whenever a candidate is discussing each strategic option, should they also discuss the impact on constraints too, in addition to the objectives? So keyword there is constraints. So Debbie,
Yeah.
want to get
Yes.
your thoughts in terms of that.
Sure. So if you look at the structure I shared, so under the quantitative analysis, one of the subtitles was impact to objectives and constraints. So that's why I put them together in the situational analysis so I could copy them. Yes, I need to talk about the impact to the objectives and the constraints because more often than not, there's at least one constraint, and that's the maximum capital they have to spend. So you need to discuss, if implementing that option, how much of the capital will be used.
All right, perfect. No, thanks for that there. Saw a question that's come in, and this was a great question. I kind of want to get to it right now. It involves more the conclusions and recommendations. So, what the candidate is asking here, Debbie, is can you provide more details on the interrelationships on the overall recommendation? So, could it be that we can do some options but not implement others? Or how do some options complement each other? They're thinking the right things here,
Yeah,
but
they
want to
are.
get your thoughts on that there.
Sure. So I'll give you another example about actually another day one case. And so, for example, one of the constraints was that they had limited studio space. And there were two options. So when you analyze those two options, individually, you might have, recommended each of them separately. But then when it came to your overall recommendation, you couldn't recommend both of them because there wasn't enough studio space. So there's an interrelationship is that there's limited studio space. So if you recommend, say, option A, that means you are unable to recommend option B. So that's the interrelationship. And it could be because of a constraint doesn't allow it. It could, another example in this particular case is if you recommend the older segment, then you want to look at, for the large parks, then you want to look at the other strategic options where the older segment would be interested in, okay? Because a lot of those other strategic options were also going to happen within the large parks. So there's the interrelationship is knowing that you've recommended the older segment for the large parks, which will complement also, it's the same segment who will be interested when it comes to API. So do you see how I'm linking those two together?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it's important to give yourself some time
Mm.
for the conclusions and recommendations, which Debbie mentioned, where you don't want to be doing this all in 5 minutes. Like,
No.
like
And
right at the end. Yeah, go ahead there, Debbie.
And you know what I was thinking, Mandeep, is that for when it comes to the interrelationships, I would probably draw myself, as I'm sitting down and I would have that paper, okay, because I'm going to have my timeline on it and managing my time. But I probably would be putting interrelationship and kind of, you know what, putting those strategic options and doing lines. So I'm like, oh, that's
Yeah.
connected, that's connected. So that would be a trigger for me, and it's a visual because I also do see in pictures. So that's where I can see putting that on the page would be helpful. And then when I go to write my overall recommendations, I'll look at my little visual and I'll think, okay, all right, there we go. I'm going to say that. So then that connects to the dot, and then that helps me frame my overall recommendation.
Yeah, no, great tip there. And the other thing which worked for me back in the day would be is that the overall user objective. Who's your primary user? What is their objective at the end of the day?
Good job. Yes.
Tie everything together at the end. It is the hardest thing to do, especially when you are in hour four.
Yeah.
It's like your adrenaline is flowing, all that. Just think about it. Okay, is what I'm saying what the it could be the board, it could be man, who knows who your primary objective is, but you want to make sure you tie everything at the end. Coincidentally or not, that's what the markers are looking for. And just think about it is, if you were getting paid to do it, that's what you would be doing in real life. So that's one
Absolutely.
thing. Yeah, that's one thing they're testing there. And I just want to say thanks to those who are filling out the survey. So for those who haven't,
Okay.
we just ask you to please fill out the survey and provide your
Yeah.
thoughts and comments. That would be greatly appreciated there. So we'll go through a couple more questions here,
Sure.
Debbie, before we end tonight's webinar. So this question's more about, I'm just going to take a step back, where the relationship between the Capstone 1 case and then the day one case. So what the candidates are asking was that, oh, okay, so if certain numbers from the Capstone 1 case are still relevant, and nothing's changed in day one, are they able to carry it forward? Type of thing. They're like, for example, it could be like rate of returns or certain, it could be interest rates or something like that. There, are they allowed to do that or making that assumption there?
Okay. Well, more often than not, you will get new information in day one. But if you're missing, you're thinking, gee, there's nothing here about an interest rate, and I need it, then you would go back to the Capstone One case and look for that information. I think more, a specific example that I know that's occurred before is, remember I said to be on the lookout for the covenant. Okay. And the day one case could say that the same covenant exists. So it doesn't tell you what it is, but it says it's the same covenant, which means you have to go back to the Capstone 1 case and find that covenant. More often than not, that's the way it would be directed. Okay. But again, CPA Canada, they're the ones, CPA, the exam markers and the Board of Examiners, they're the ones who create the exam. But that's sort of what's happened in the past.
Yeah. No, exactly. So we'll go through one or two questions here. So this question I want to, because it just came in right now, I think it's important here. So it's talking about kind of what do we need to know from Capstone 1 to help in terms of being prepared for the day one case. So they just wanted more clarification on, so should candidates memorize the vision and mission and values from the Capstone One case? They're asking like, do they not get access to that during the day one CFE case? Just want to get your thoughts on that, just to help
Sure.
clarify that further.
Absolutely. So I know that I've mentioned it a few times that CPA Canada does highly recommend that you memorize the company's mission, vision, values, and key success factors. Okay. Because you want to make sure there's two very important reasons. You want to make sure that they're top of mind. So as soon as you start reading about the strategic options and the different required, you're already thinking, Hmm. Is that aligned with the mission, vision, values? Does that capitalize on a key success factor? Because if you aren't able to pull enough examples of integration from your SWOT, then you're going to need to refer to those. If you don't know them well enough, what's going to happen is they won't be top of mind. You'll also have to go through the Capstone One case. It's fairly easy to find the mission, vision, and values, but it is extremely difficult to find the key success factors. So the strongest reason is you need to know those and you need to be able to apply them quickly when you're reading what the different requireds are. And if you don't know what they are, then you aren't going to consider them when it comes to integration opportunities.
Yeah, so that's one thing there. They've given you the case purposely before. So then that way you can spend the time and all that there. You don't want to be doing this right away when you get to see the case for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah.
In regards to that. And then this will be the last question here. Thanks. Sorry if we weren't able to answer all your questions here, but I saved this one purposely for last because it's one where I just want to give more reassurance here. So the question that came up here is that is there a wrong answer? Or is it okay like to put something together as long as it's supported? So I know a
Oh,
lot of candidates are thinking, do they have to get the perfect answer?
there, you know what? Again, there is, as long as your rationale is sound, then there is no perfect answer as such. I mean, even when you're looking at practice cases and there's a solution, and if you have access to that and there's sample responses, I've seen many instances where the sample response, they recommended something while the solution didn't recommend it. As long as your rationale is sound and it makes sense, you know what? That that's great. The only kind of caveat I do want to say is when it comes to your overall recommendation, if you haven't really, you know what, if you didn't, I don't know, if you didn't really address the importance of what needed to be done and the strategy for the large parks, okay? If you didn't put that as a priority, that's a big error, okay? Because that's a significant issue. If you exceed your constraints, that's a significant issue. But, there's ways of being able to support an option and also be able to support implementing it and not implementing it.
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, you said it great there, Debbie. Yeah, the main thing there, what I don't want you guys in terms of writing day one to do is like, oh, I'm just gonna recommend all five options, and then that's your conclusion there. Do not do that in
Mhm,
regards to that, because one of the things which Debbie outlined here, conclusions and recommendations, that is part of the passing profile.
mhm.
So, like, if they're not looking for the perfect answer, as Debbie mentioned, this is the big thing here. It's not the perfect answer. Is it a rational answer? Is it reasonable? Is it something you can implement in process? Like, it may not be the, oh, okay, there could be a better answer. Yeah, but you won't get penalized for that. As Debbie mentioned, you will get penalized if you put something unreasonable. So
Right.
that's why I want to end it there, Debbie, where it's
Wonderful.
give yourself time for the recommendations and
Yes,
conclusions.
please.
Please. Yeah, that's one thing. I've talked to candidates who haven't gone through day one. They basically tell me is that analysis great, everything was great, and they just rushed through the end, and then that's where it ended up falling apart. So that's
Mm.
why, please, 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 I'm at the end of the day.
I know. I'm with you, Betty. Don't
Yeah.
do it.
Don't do
But
it. So in regards to
exactly.
that. All right. Yeah, so sorry if we weren't able to answer in terms of your final questions here, but we want to thank everybody for attending tonight's webinar. And the last thing I'll say is because this will be the last time we'll be chatting with you is you got a month and a bit to go. You
Hmm.
guys will get there in
You will.
regards to that. Just power and push through, and we believe in you guys. So, and believe in yourself. So, in regards to
Absolutely.
that. But otherwise, we will let you guys go. And best of luck to everybody who's listening on the CFE there.
Best of luck, guys.